Good evening, and welcome to the President's Lecture Series this evening. You have the privilege in just a moment of listening to Ruth Fremson, staff photojournalist with the New York Times. I'm Keith Graham. I'm assistant professor and director of the photojournalism program here at the School of Journalism at the University of Montana. And we just want to thank you all for coming out tonight. First of all, I'd like to first thank President George Dennison for his continued support of the Presidential Lecture Series, and for Richard Drake, who told us tonight he's been coordinator for 18 years, and without that and his work, continued efforts of getting wonderful speakers here, this would not be happening. So Richard, thank you. And for Michelle, and for Michelle Shaughnessy in the President's office, because she's coordinated and made all the details work. So thank you, Michelle. And lastly, to Nancy Boardman, because Nancy saw a photograph of Ruth's and it moved her. It moved her to do something, and it moved her. And because of that, Ruth Fremson is here tonight. And first of all, it spoke to me because it shows to me the power of photography, that it can communicate in an intellectual manner, but in a physical manner, in an emotional manner. It grabs you, and it makes you pay attention to what that photograph is trying to say. And Ruth, who is a New York native, grew up in Queens. She was studying in Syracuse, doing a double major in graphic design and photography, and had an internship at an advertising agency, and found out through that, even though she did get a 10-second commercial produced, that you know what? Advertising wasn't for her. In the fall of her senior year, she had the opportunity at Syracuse to go to London to study. And she had the opportunity to study under Bob Gilka, who was former director of photography at National Geographic. And it's through his efforts as a teacher that really Ruth got plugged in and really said, you know, after seeing this, I didn't want to do anything else. And also because Mr. Gilka wrote a wonderful letter of recommendation. She did grad school at Ohio. From there, got an internship at the Washington Times. Then was a staff photographer there. Then from there went to AP in Charlotte, North Carolina, then to Washington with AP, and then to Jerusalem. From there, and since year 2000, she's been with the New York Times. Since she's been with the New York Times, she has been in almost every major conflict since then. You'll hear her speak about that momentarily. But more importantly, so that you understand, too, what her peers think about her. While she was at AP, she was part of the staff Pulitzer there for the Clinton impeachment. She also, twice, while she's been a staff photojournalist at the New York Times, has won Pulitzers for coverage in Afghanistan and Pakistan, and for the work at 9/11. It's with great pleasure that I introduce to you Ruth Fremson.
Hello, and thank you all for coming out. Looks like a big crowd, although I have a hard time seeing you because of the spotlight, but I appreciate you all being here. And for those of you that were kind enough to come this afternoon, you're going to see some repetitive images, and just stick with me. We'll get through it. September 11th was a day that changed the world. It changed my life of those around me, and this country, and the course of events to follow. And what I'm going to show you tonight is the journey I've been taking following the events that have unfolded since then. we'll go through photos by photos. They're in a few sections from September 11th to Pakistan and Afghanistan and then on to Iraq, where I spent 3.5 months before, during, and after the war, returning here in June of last year. And afterwards, we'll have time for your questions. So let's begin. It might be helpful. Okay. Can everyone see the photos okay? Bright enough? All right. On September 11th, I was photographing features in the morning out in Queens. It was our Democratic mayoral primary, and we thought it would be a normal voting day. I was working early, and we got word that a plane had hit the first tower. So our photo desk mobilized, got everybody moving in different directions, and we tried to get people close to the scene as soon as we could get there. Of course, being out in Queens at rush hour on the way into the city is pretty a difficult task. But I managed to get behind a convoy of emergency vehicles that were heading into the city, and I just stuck to their tail, and we ended up right at the base of the towers, which is where this photo was taken when the people were being evacuated from the World Trade Center, from the towers, and the triage area was here. This was one of the women that was evacuated from the building, who I'm happy to report is alive and doing well. We are in contact occasionally, and while she didn't want her name used, she was happy to tell me and report that she was okay. She'd had several surgeries, but she was doing all right. This picture was taken just after the first building fell. When the first building started to come down, it sounded, this loud rumbling started, and I thought a third plane was being flown into the towers. That's the sound of it. And, I realized that it wasn't the plane at all, but the building was coming apart. So everybody sort of was running and screaming and looking for cover. And I dove under a car, and the gentleman in the background with the white shirt in this photograph is the policeman who was also under the car with me. And we both stumbled into this deli shortly after that as things began to settle around us. And inside there were a few policemen and firemen, and the policeman in the foreground trying to catch his breath is a guy named Richie Adamiak. And it was, as you can imagine, a surreal situation. I mean, you're looking here towards the front of the deli where you really should be seeing daylight outside because it was a gorgeous day just like it is today here. And instead, you're just seeing darkness because you were inside that cloud. The next morning, we were in need of an aerial shot that would show this, the scope of the scene, because the airspace was closed and there was really it was very difficult to get around it, and even if you could, it was very difficult to show just the scope of the devastation. So I was lucky enough with a couple of other photographers to bump into the manager of one of the apartment buildings, the residential buildings in the area, and I asked him, is it possible to go up to the roof and take a picture? And he said, well, I have 2 buildings that I manage. He said, one, we have a generator, so we have an elevator running. But if you'd like to, you can walk the 44 flights up the other one. So I'll let you decide which one I took. And a week later, this is at the end of the week, at Yankee Stadium, the memorial service, it was the first citywide memorial service that was being held. And America was just starting to try to understand what had happened and cope with the shock and the disbelief and the grief, the incredible amount of grief. And just as this was happening, after this, I took off and I headed for Pakistan, where over there, I could see that the story was shifting, and it was going to shift away from the United States pretty quickly, in the sense that the US was going to respond to this attack. And I wanted to follow this story, and I felt very strongly that I knew it was going to end up in the Islamic world, and I had had experience there, and I felt strongly enough that I wanted to go, and so I expressed interest, and my editor said, okay, great, let's go. And So this is in Islamabad, Pakistan. It was the first day I arrived, and it was an anti-US demonstration. And all these hands went up when they were asked who's going to go fight jihad, which means the holy war. And I remember thinking at this point, I wonder how many of these guys are really going to, quit their day jobs and go out and do this. One of the big influences in the Islamic world has been Al Jazeera television and Al Arabiya television, which are very, very powerful. And in every Pakistani home that has a television, they would be watching these sorts of things, and it would inflame people and bring them out on the streets. And the demonstrations were getting more and more passionate and volatile and anti-American as the feeling got stronger that there would, the reprisal was coming, and there would be the bombing of Afghanistan would happen. And in this photograph, it was a demonstration, and in his zeal to burn the American flag, this demonstrator himself actually caught fire. And as the bombing started, the refugees started flooding into Pakistan from neighboring Afghanistan and into the refugee camps. And I spent about 3 weeks working on a story at the Shamshatu refugee camp outside of Peshawar with a reporter, Peter Moss, for the New York Times Magazine. And this was the kind of dust that was in the air at twilight. It was in the air all the time, but at twilight it just took on this really ethereal quality. So these are scenes now from the refugee camp. And this woman, her name is Malika, and she was an Afghan refugee from near Jalalabad, and when the bombing began there, she left with her family of 11 people to get away from it and came into Pakistan, but she was in labor for 11 hours on the back of a donkey as they left the city and crossed the border. And her baby, which you see on the left, was born just after she arrived. And we had met her about 24 hours later when she was just, completely exhausted, devastated. You could just see she just had no idea how she was going to feed her family, which really was going to be her responsibility. And she didn't pick up this baby once the whole time we were there. I remember that really striking me, that she was just too tired to even pick up her newborn. So these were some of the women, and being a woman in such a conservative Islamic culture was actually an asset. A lot of people have asked me, is that hard or is it difficult to be a woman? And there are situations that being a woman is not an advantage, but there are situations where being a woman is an advantage. And one of the things you can do is go into the private quarters of homes and you can meet the women. And there are wonderful stories to be told and people to be seen and to tell about who are hidden. And so these are some of the women and the children that I met. This is a tent school at the refugee camp. And this is a distribution of food aid by the World Food Program. And word got out in the camp one day that there was going to be a distribution of food, and it was in addition to their normal rations. And there was this stampede to this walled-in compound where people thought that they were going to get food. And in this photograph, they had closed the gates because they knew they didn't have enough for everybody, and they were only letting certain amounts of people in, and so women started scaling the walls. And it was really an extraordinary sight to see women who are normally very docile, who walk around completely covered from head to toe, jumping over walls just so they could get a little extra food for their families. It was quite a statement in desperation. This is the bakery. The flour would be taken to the bakery and then be baked in the ovens while people waited for it, and then taken home to their mud homes. And this is actually a fairly comfortable home in the refugee camp, but I thought it would be interesting to see. It's just very different from a Western-style home. The mats on the floor, on a rug. Food is served, a typical meal is served on a tray with bowls of food, and it's sort of communal eating. And you can see the walls are mud. This is a health clinic, and I'm happy to point out that it's a female doctor here. These are women waiting in line for treatment. And here's a woman getting a vaccination. Her friend's enjoying her agony, which we've all been through, right? And then we have a woman, once again covered up with her child leaving. Everything is walled in and, separated, and women are kept hidden. And this is just to give you a sense of, the beautiful scope of the scenery there. As the Taliban began to fall, my goal while I was in Pakistan was not only to cover the daily events, but to eventually get into Afghanistan. That was the prime reason for being there. And the Times had photographers spread out in different areas. We had two reporter and photographer teams in the north with the Northern Alliance. Then we thought we would be able to get a photographer in through Peshawar in the north and then through Quetta in the south. And I ended up, as the Taliban began to fall, in the south outside of Quetta. And this is the border town of Shaman, where we would drive up to pretty much every day. It was a 3-hour drive up and a 3-hour drive back, and we would have to get permission each day to do this from the authorities, the Pakistani authorities. And it was it was grueling, and you just wanted, at this point, you just wanted to get into Afghanistan already, but the Taliban were still, even though they had fallen very quickly in the north, were holding firm in Kandahar in Afghanistan, in southern Afghanistan, which was really their stronghold. And finally, when the Taliban's embassies closed everywhere in the world, they realized that they didn't have any way to get their word out unless they brought the journalists into them. So they decided that they would arrange a trip for journalists to come into Afghanistan. They promised that they would take them to Kandahar and that they could meet Mullah Omar, and they would have a press conference. So initially, the Taliban said, well, we're not taking any women. We're just taking the male journalists. So, of course, some of my male colleagues were, bye-bye Ruth, we'll see ya. And then there were a couple of reporters, Sarah Chase from NPR among them, and another reporter from the LA Times, another woman, who kicked up a bit of a fuss. And they called me and they said, get back over here and put your visa application in, they're gonna take us. And they said then that they could take us, but we would have to leave at night. And then they said, well, you can stay at night, but you're gonna have to sleep separately from where the men sleep. And in the end, they put us all in this abandoned UN compound, and we were sleeping in tents, and I was sleeping with our driver, our translator, and the two reporters I was traveling with, so, And this is Mullah Omar's spokesman, who came to tell us, after a few days, that we would not be meeting Mullah Omar, and that we were going to have to leave the area. We were in a place called Spin Boldak, which was really not very far over the border, and we were going to have to leave because they could no longer protect us. So we headed back to Quetta until the Taliban actually did fall in Kandahar, and then we could return. We went back into Kandahar, and when we got there, this was a fairly typical scene. These were some of the warlords' men, and they were all over. This kind of, these kind of accessories were all over. I mean, RPGs, automatic weapons, bandoliers of ammunition. I mean, it was. I've never seen that many weapons all together in one place, and it was quite amazing. This is one of my favorite pictures as a native New Yorker. It's U.S. Special Forces, actually, who were in there, and they were, the man in charge of Kandahar at that time was a guy named Gulaga, and they were helping him out, and they were also going through Mullah Omar's compound and working there. And it was just hilarious to see them, you wouldn't see them very often, and they would come kind of screeching around corners all of a sudden out of the blue, and in these Afghan hats as the guy on the right is wearing, and in this case they had this bumper sticker, which was just, it was really, really touched me. It's really sweet. And this is the kind of contrast of cultures there. You had a Special Forces soldier on the right and a typical Afghan man on the left in Mullah Omar's compound. And again, this was where he lived and one of his places. These graves were for foreign fighters, meaning non-Afghans, meaning fighters from other countries who came to help their cause, the Taliban's cause. And they were killed there, but there was no one to collect the bodies. And so the Afghans took it upon themselves to give them a proper burial. And they marked them all off in this little area. This was sort of an interesting thing, I thought, just culturally. It was a holiday, and all the little kids were dressed up, and the girls were dressed completely, makeup, mommy dress up, shoes, little purses, jewelry. And I thought it was so interesting that they would dress them up to look like grown-up women, but then this is how grown-up women actually would walk around on the streets. So I thought it was sort of an interesting contrast there. So now we're going to jump ahead. It's the first anniversary of September 11th, and this is from Ground Zero, the memorial service. This is a police officer in the base of, at the bottom of where the towers stood. And shortly after this, Kofi Annan was at the General Assembly at the United Nations in New York, and in this photo he's listening as George Bush makes his speech to the General Assembly, making his case for action against Iraq. And now we jump to Iraq. This is an Iraqi soldier in his bunker up on the hill. They weren't that far away. I mean, this is a telephoto lens, but they weren't so far away that you couldn't see them up there. I was in the north. I was not an embedded journalist. Although I had the choice to be, I wanted to work with the correspondent David Rode that I was working with, and he was going to be covering the north. And it's a roll of the dice, and perhaps it was good, perhaps it was bad. I'm not the least bit unhappy about it. We had correspondents and photographers positioned all around the country, embedded, not embedded, in Baghdad, not in Baghdad. And David and I managed to get in through Turkey, which was a test in itself just to get into Iraq. You couldn't just get a Continental Airlines flight and go in. You had to go in through, a surrounding country. And Iran was not very forthcoming with visas for Americans. Neither was Syria. You could go in through Kuwait, but again, I said I wanted to be working with David. We had worked together before. And so we decided we would just take our chances. And David I actually benefited from all his work. He had been traveling around Armenia, trying to get visas there, all these various places. And finally we heard that the Turkish government might allow some journalists to go into northern Iraq. They might open their border just specifically for us to cover the opposition meeting in Salahuddin, which is in northern Iraq in Kurdish territory. So we got to Turkey as fast as we could and then traveled all the way to the southeastern part of the country. And after 2 days of negotiating and getting on buses and off buses, and actually getting on a bus and driving a mile before being turned back by the Turkish military, they actually did open the border and let us in. And they said, you're going to cover this meeting, you're going for 5 days. Those of you who come back, you'll never work in Turkey again. But most people didn't come back. And I think everything is forgiven in that case. So I was in the north again, and here we are, and everybody was just waiting. You could see the silhouettes of the Iraqi soldiers up on the hill, and you didn't know what was going to happen next. And as the time got closer and things became more and more tense, people began fleeing the population centers. These are some Kurds who were leaving the population centers. They didn't want to be there. They were afraid that Saddam would turn around and attack the Kurds, perhaps gas the Kurds again, and they wanted to be as far away as possible. So they went into the countryside and they set up camps and trailers and tents and were living out there. And these women are just baking bread. This is gypsies. These are gypsies, and they also left the population centers and set up a camp in this, unfortunately, not a great spot. And this was Erbil when everybody left. I mean, this should have been a bustling market day, but instead, very few people decided to stick around. They were also saying to us, they were emptying their shops and taking all things away. And we said, well, why don't you just lock it up and leave? And they said, because it will be looted. I mean, they anticipated the looting. For those who did stay, they did sell lots of plastic sheeting for people to seal their houses in case of any kind of chemical or gas attack. And then this was just a night street scene in Erbil in northern Iraq. Now, what was really interesting in the north, although the Northern Front idea was thwarted by the Turks, who didn't let the Americans in through Turkey, in order to keep the Iraqi army divided, there were a couple hundred special forces soldiers for the United States that were in the north, and they were working with Kurdish Peshmerga soldiers, who are the guys in the beige there on the right. And they were working together to kind of keep the Iraqi army in the north engaged and keep them thinking that there were a lot more of them than there actually were, so that they would stay up north and not all go down and become a bigger challenge for the soldiers in the south. And here you have, this is essentially a hilltop that they took over, an Iraqi position, as they advanced. These are some soldiers arriving up near their position. And this is in northern Iraq also, looks a little like Montana up there. It's actually very, very, very beautiful, especially, in the winter time. Again, these are the special forces, and what they would do is they would call in airstrikes on Iraqi positions. They would call in coordinates, and then you'd have the Peshmerga soldiers here who would watch the bombs falling in the distance. And this is the ridge where they lived on for a couple of weeks while this battle was going on, until the Iraqis retreated and started to fall, and Saddam fell as well. And the contrails you see are from the B-52s, and one of the Special Forces soldiers said to me after a particularly tough day when they were taking a lot of mortar and artillery fire, he said, "That was the prettiest sight I ever saw." So, and this is the results of some of the coalition bombing, as is this. This is at a mosque. As the Iraqi army retreated, everyone would advance into their positions. And these are some Iraqi soldiers. And then, as we all know, the Iraqi army began to crumble and retreat. And as we moved down from the north, and everyone else was moving up from the south, as they would come across any kind of remnants of Saddam's regime, it would be crushed, destroyed, toppled, whatever. This was the day that Kirkuk fell, and these are Iraqi soldiers who surrendered. And it was a really tough sight. I mean, these guys were really, really, really hungry. They hadn't eaten. They were telling stories of, in the final days where young men would be pulled out of their homes, given a gun, and pushed out on the front line, and they couldn't leave there. They couldn't desert because they had units behind them. If anyone tried to flee, they would be shot by their own people. So they surrendered to the Kurds, and the Kurds fed them and put them in a room, and then eventually let them just go home. So as Saddam fell, this is in Erbil, the Kurds were incredibly delighted. They had suffered under Saddam a great deal for years. And here some guys are getting set to burn a picture of him. Here they're just, flying through the streets, cheering, flags waving, horns blaring in celebration. This guy, I know, I think he was a little media savvy. There was goodwill up there. And there was goodwill in the beginning. There really was. I mean, there were also people carrying pictures of Tony Blair, by the way. American flags, but what's really interesting too, I saw in Kirkuk one day, one of the Special Forces soldiers handing out the flags. Oh, okay, that's where they're getting them from. But up here in Erbil, I think they actually had them on their own. And this is in Baghdad, when the statues of any Ba'athist leader would be brought down, but later on. And, you know, the sole of the foot, showing the sole of the foot is an insult in this culture, and so this man throwing his shoe at the statue is a particularly harsh insult. And here it comes down. This is the photo that brought me here to Montana. This was the day that Kirkuk fell, and the gift I got on this horrible day, or shortly afterwards, was when Nancy Borgman sent me an email and said, "Your picture moved me, and what can we do to help this little girl?" And it was wonderful, because you're out there and you're working and you're wondering sometimes, is anybody paying attention out there? And it was really, really nice to hear that somebody was not only paying attention, but they were willing to say, "Hey, we're out here in Montana, and we just, I want you to know that this is on my mind." So it was great. And this little girl, we stopped at the hospital in Kirkuk. The city had just fallen. We were among the first journalists to get in. And again, you had the same scene like you had in Erbil that I just showed you a couple of moments ago. You had cars like flying into the center of the city, waving their flags, horns blaring, people cheering. Everybody wanted to go topple the statue of Saddam in the center of town. Celebrations. And we wanted to see really how much of a struggle had it been for the city to be turned over. And we stopped at the hospital, which is often a very good place to get statistics about wounded and dead and so on. And it was a busy place, that emergency room. And this man brought in his daughter, Sumaya, who was 3 years old, was caught in the crossfire and had shrapnel in her head. And he was understandably very angry at the Americans. She's an Arab child, as opposed to being Kurdish in the north, where you have a big mix of the population. It's primarily Kurdish, though. She, they didn't know if she was going to live. The doctor told me a very serious prognosis for her. He thought that the shrapnel was in her brain. And this was as I said, busy soldiers being brought in, fighters being brought in, civilians being brought in, and yet you had this celebration going on. And then I went outside for a minute to get some air and just collect myself, and one car sort of broke off from the pack past the hospital and came screeching onto the hospital grounds. And this woman jumped out and flung open the back door and started screaming the same thing over and over. And her husband, a civilian, had been wounded, caught in the crossfire also of the fighting, and he had died on the way to the hospital. So she was just realizing that he was dead. And later I asked my translator what she had been saying, and he said that she had just been saying over and over, "Muhammad, I told you not to go out." Oops, sorry. Oops. There we go. So it was, this was probably for me, a crystallizing moment. It was just this, victory and defeat, and joy and sorrow, and it was incredibly surreal. And I actually, for a minute, I froze when I saw this scene in front of me, because it was so personal, and I felt I was really intruding just by being there. And then I realized, but I am here for a reason, and it's to show what a war is all about. So that was how this photo got taken. Meanwhile, down the street, the looting was beginning. This is a government building, and people were just going in and taking whatever they could possibly take. The next day, Mosul fell, and the looting and chaos in Mosul was really bad for the first week and a half, 2 weeks. It was really chaotic. This picture is from the bank, and what was happening there is somebody had used an RPG to blow open the bank vault, and people were fighting over the money inside. and shooting each other over it. And so it was particularly dangerous to actually be on the street in the middle of this mob. So I got up in a building, and this was kind of the day where at a certain point we all realized it's time to get out of the city, because there was no one in control. There was a power vacuum. The Israeli army had sort of drifted away. There hadn't been much fighting. The looting was starting, and gun battles were breaking out around the city, and there were fedayeen flying around. We actually found ourselves, as we were driving through the city for a minute, caught in one of their convoys, and just quickly realized, we don't want to be with these guys. And so we just took a quick right turn and got out of it. But this is a guy running away from that scene with money under his shirt, and his clothes are torn from the fight. This was a dentist's office. So it was just everything got destroyed. We actually thought, when we heard that Mosul fell, that we could go to the hotel and check in, and we would just move ourselves to Mosul. And this was the hotel. I mean, not only were they dragging the beds out, but they were throwing mattresses from the roof and from the higher floors just down, because it was easier than carrying it down the stairs. So we went back to Erbil and kept just making daily trips in. It was just not safe to stay in the city the first week at all. As I said, gun battles were breaking out, and one of the places that they just kept erupting was at the hospital, outside the hospital. And so a special forces team was sent to the hospital to try to at least maintain order there so that the wounded could get in and out. And while we were there one day, a gun battle broke out because some Arabs began firing on a car of Kurds that they suspected of stealing and looting. And so this gun battle broke out. It just happened to happen near the hospital. Then the special forces got involved, and in the course of it, the car that the Kurds were driving in, the wounded man, his foot was jammed on the gas pedal, and this car just came careening into the front of the hospital and crashed. And one of the guys was still in there, and this is one of the guys that they hauled out of the car. And on the right, you have an Iraqi Defense Force person, newly trained, working with the special forces, which are the two guys on the left. And not only were they going to haul him in and arrest him for looting if they could figure out that that's what he was doing, or detain him, there was really no way to arrest him, but in a way they were also protecting him because he was Kurd, the city was heavily Arab, and they were very hostile towards the looters or anyone they suspected was coming into their city to loot. Now this was his less fortunate friend who was mortally wounded, and as they tried to bring his body into the hospital on the gurney, some of the Arabs started cursing him and kicking the gurney and spitting on his body. Inside the hospital, the special forces here had to tell the doctors that they would have to treat the wounded Kurdish man. And there's a third man here, which you see a little bit in the background, blindfolded. And the doctors didn't want to treat him. And the special forces guy said to him, "No, you will treat him. You're a doctor. It's your job." So this is some of the ethnic tensions that have flared up and have the potential to flare up over there. Another problem is the UXOs, or unexploded ordnances, that are all over the place. Another problem with not having a northern front is you didn't have the men to sort of secure these cities, right? So you had the 173rd Airborne that had come in was in Kirkuk, and when Mosul fell, there was really nobody to go in and secure the city except these handful of special forces. And so at the same time, there were munition depots, unexploded ordnances lying around because things that fall but don't explode just sit there. And children pick them up and play with them. And they like to see things go bang. And unfortunately, what happens is they don't know how to handle them. And these little boys had been playing with something, and there were 5 of them. It all just blew up in their faces, and they'll be disfigured now for the rest of their lives. And they were just, they had gone back to the hospital to see if there was anything else they could do, and there was really nothing new that the hospital could do for them, so they were on their way home now. This is Colonel Walter Meyer, commander for the Special Forces in Mosul, and he was sent in with his men to get control of the city. Well, the first day they tried to come in and go to the city hall and set up shop was the first day of the looting, the same day of the bank vault being blown up and all that you saw earlier. And as soon as they drove to the center of town, they came under fire and they turned around and went out. And so this went on. It took you know, a good week before it came under control. And then Mosul was actually a pretty good success story for a while. And so he was the new sheriff in town, if you will. And here, these are all ex-officers from the Iraqi army who came to him essentially, either they wanted protection because they were afraid of reprisals, they wanted to turn themselves in, and he really just wanted intelligence. And most of these guys just went back home because they didn't really have anywhere to put them. In this case, another thing that they had to do was get to know the tribal leaders and get to know who's who, whose allegiances are where. And this is a meeting with one of the sheikhs, one of the tribal leaders in the city, trying to regain security, lots of weapons everywhere. And they got a report that that this guy had been shooting at his mother, kind of a domestic dispute, right? So they went out and they found that he had hidden his weapons down in the bottom of this sort of puddle watering hole. Life does go on despite all of the stuff, and and this was just one of those funny little moments, as was this one. It was after a rain, and this was in Mosul, and they were getting ready to go out on patrol. Okay. This one too, you know, this was soldiers patrolling. This is in Baghdad, and these soldiers were visiting the school, and they are, you know, they're in charge of making sure everything was okay, and the schools are open and, you know, functioning. I mean, this particular day was one of the first days that the schools were opening in Baghdad, and there were very few students that actually showed up. But no matter where you go in Iraq, you have to sit down and have tea or coffee. Here are some of the students saying goodbye. This is in Baghdad, in Sadr City, which we've been hearing a lot about, which used to be formerly called Saddam City. And here the Shia, or the Shiites, however you want to pronounce it, were working on a new mural, whereas this had before been a huge mural of Saddam Hussein. They were now painting this mural to express their own religious beliefs. And if you've been following any news photos lately, you would have seen this mural in the background of Sadr City, where all the insurgents were fighting recently. This is just a typical home. Friday prayers that spilled outside of the mosque because of the overflow. And this is a woman who had been a prisoner in an Iraqi prison for a long time, held because she was a Shiite, and she had her brother and her brother's friend were in hiding because they were accused of religious activity. And so she had heard one of them was wounded and went to take him bandages, and for that reason she was put in prison, and I think it was 7 years. So she took us back to the prison to kind of show us where she had been held. Another important situation to understand, I think, is the mass graves that have been uncovered and continue to be uncovered, but were really starting to be uncovered in large numbers back in last May. Thousands of people disappeared in 1991 after the Shiites and the Kurds in the south and the Kurds in the north rose up against Saddam after the first Gulf War. And they thought that they would topple Saddam with the help of the United States, but we didn't. We chose not to at that time, and when Saddam crushed the uprisings, thousands of them were executed or put in prison and went missing. And their families never knew what happened. There were rumors, there were suspicions, but there was no way for them under Saddam to go and start digging up any ground. So they were able to do that now, and they were trying very hard to identify remains, and if they had a sense of, you know, if they could find the records from the regime where relative or friend was, then they could go to that spot and start digging and try to find it. And the reason for that is they wanted the closure of a proper burial. So this is a family digging up their brother, and what they would do in another one, this is near Hilla, they would bundle them. They would bundle them together, and they would try to number them in some format, and then they would bring in the families who would go through the remains and try to identify whose belonged to them. And in some cases, I actually saw a woman, with her hair, taking a bundle of hair and like putting it on a skull and like trying to see if she recognized the person. It was very sad. This was a woman who did actually believe that she found her relative. You have some good relationships being built there. This is the head of the Dora oil refinery on the left, and Captain Tom Huff on the right, his job was to be in charge of this refinery and keep it going. And so they developed a very good relationship in the course of trying to take care of this crumbling old refinery, which this is the refinery. This is a photo of the Special Forces training, some of the new Iraqi Defense Forces. And this is another job for the soldiers there. Here they were trying to supervise the pension payments to pensioners. They were getting a one-time payment of $40. And they hadn't been paid since the war started, and so they really needed the money. And it became a very chaotic situation. Inside you'd have the staff, checking people's names off on a list, and outside you had these people just pushing and shoving, afraid that they wouldn't get their share. And here was a little boy who got lost, and a man who was trying to prove that he needed his payment. And for those people who couldn't sign because they couldn't write, they could just put their thumbprint down. And, again, there are nice moments, there are nice interactions between the Iraqis and the Americans, and there's some genuine, this is, winning the hearts and minds, and here's a young soldier carrying a heavy gas canister for cooking gas out to this woman's car. Arresting the looters was a typical scene at that time. And this is another image of men that have been detained because they're on suspicion of looting. And then, we're almost at the end now. This is when the roadside bombings began, and this was last June, and this is one of the first ones on the road to the airport in Baghdad, outside of Baghdad. And I left shortly after that, but I had in November, I was able to go down to Walter Reed Army Medical Center. And the one thing that I don't think can be stressed enough is that wounded doesn't mean scratched and can be patched up. In this conflict, the body armor is better and there's a greater chance of survival, but wounded can mean very, very serious injuries. This is a soldier, Specialist Robert Acosta, who's 20 years old, and he was riding in a Humvee, and somebody threw a grenade into his Humvee. And he went to pick it up and to throw it out of the cab, and when he did, he dropped it between his legs, and he grabbed it again, and that split second cost him his hand. So here he is, living with this and telling us about this at the hospital. This guy is Specialist Thomas Love from Clarksville, Tennessee with the 101st Airborne. And he's on his way to a bowling outing. They try to get the soldiers to go out and, in part of their rehab. And it was the first day he was off his pain medication. He'd lost his left arm. This is Sergeant Eric Castro, who's 23, and his leg was destroyed in an ambush between Chaldea and Fallujah, which, again, we've been hearing a lot about. This young couple, they're just really special people. They're both reservists. And it's Staff Sergeant Ryan Kelly, who's 23, and his wife, Lindsay. She's 21. And they were both civil affairs people. They were over there to be the liaison between the Iraqis and help get programs going. And they were both over there when his convoy was ambushed. And he lost, his right foot and lower part of his leg. Then we're coming sort of full circle now. This is Marianne Fontana and her son Aiden. His father was a firefighter who died in the World Trade Center, and this is where they were 2 years later. And lastly, this was the 2-year anniversary of September 11th, and this is Anthony Takeda, who's holding a photo of his firefighter uncle, Lenny Regaglia, at Ground Zero at the ceremony. So, I would be happy to take any questions from you guys at all. Yeah, please.
I think you can tell by seeing her work how strong a photographer she is. And Ruth told me this afternoon that when she went to AP, she was a photographer. When she left AP, she was a journalist. And I think you can see that these photographs tell stories. And Ruth would love to take your questions now. We've got 2 microphones. If you will kindly walk up to one of those microphones, and you're most welcome to ask her anything that you would like to, and she'll be most happy to try to answer those questions. As you're doing that, I want to say one other thing that Ruth said this afternoon, which I thought was really insightful. She's been a photographer at newspapers for a long time now, and she said, you know, as a photographer at a daily newspaper, you're a daily documentary photographer, because you're photographing each day in your community, whether it's here in Missoula or whether it's in New York City or in Iraq. And that people will look back and see that the photographers at papers were the daily historians and documentarians of that time. So if you have questions, please go to the mics. Thank you.
Can we also get some lights so that I can see who's out there asking?
Can we get the
house lights? We could do that.
Go ahead and ask.
Yeah,
go ahead and...
I have 2 questions for you. The first one is, what happened to the little girl with the shrapnel in her head?
Mm-hmm.
And the second one is, how long were you actually over in Afghanistan and Iran and during that whole time period?
Okay, let's see. Sumaya, I got to visit her a few times after that day in the hospital, and first time I went back to track her down, she was doing better. She wasn't great. The translator I was working with, happily, is a doctor, and so he looked at it for me and dressed her wounds, and we went back to check on her again. And she's doing great. She's fine. I haven't been in touch with the family since I left, but when I left, she was healed and happy, happy little girl. How long was I there? I went to Pakistan on September 26, 2001, and came back just in time for Christmas. So that was about 3 months. And when I went to Iraq, I left home in mid-February and came home in June. So about 3.5 months, I guess. Hi.
Hi, I was wondering if you had any problems with suppression of your photographs?
By whom? What do you... No, not really. This question got asked earlier in the day, and I thought it was a really interesting question. I'll take my photographs and I'll file them into the paper, and then it's really our editor's decision to choose what to run. And we tend to have an aversion here in this country to, putting anything too rough on the front page. I mean, people really don't like to see it over their morning coffee. And so editors tend to shy away from the tougher stuff, which you will see published in Europe and in other parts of the world much more freely. I thought that the Times did a good job when there was that situation in Fallujah last week. where the Blackwater employees were ambushed and dragged through the streets and killed and burned and hung on the bridge. I mean, it was such a horrible, disturbing, tragic situation. But I think it was really important for people here to see the kind of anger that there really is there. And by putting that on the front page, you're showing that. A lot of papers were afraid to use the really strong images. So I'm not sure if I'm answering your question exactly. There's no real suppression, in no intentional suppression. There's no, I've never had any censorship, but there is an archive of photos that probably most people won't ever see, as somebody pointed out this afternoon. So, hi.
This is just a kind of an idle question, but it has puzzled me for some time. 50 years ago in Berkeley, I had a friend from Baghdad who introduced me to his sister and brother-in-law. He said that his brother-in-law was from Mosul, and I hear it called Mosul all the time. What is the reason for the
Difference in
the
pronunciation?
difference? Yeah.
Kabul, Kabul, Mosul. I can't answer that. You hear it pronounced both ways. So, he's the Iraqi, he's probably right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'd like to applaud you for your very compelling images. I think this
Thank you.
is great for this community to see this kind of work.
Thank you all for turning out to see it. I'm really impressed that you all came.
I'd like to ask about techniques, lenses, cameras, the process for you taking a photograph to be published.
Okay, there's this great thing now called technology. It's really made our lives so much easier. I've been shooting digital photography since 1996 when AP decided to go completely digital. And there's been several generations of digital cameras since, and they've gotten better and better and better. And you see it all the time in Newsweek, and you may not even realize it's not film anymore. It's gotten to the point where it's good enough for magazines. And even National Geographic actually has used some digital pictures from time to time. So the quality is getting there. Now when you have a digital camera, you have a flash card, a little hard drive that goes into the camera instead of a roll of film. And you don't need to carry around a dark room or chemicals or have water to process your images. What I do is after I'm done taking my photographs, the flash card, and I happen to have one right here, I can show you how little it is. Gets put into this thing, and this is the actual flash card. So you see how little it is. This is 512 megabytes. It's about the equivalent of 3 rolls of film. I stick it into this thing right here, plop it back into my camera, and then through a photo program, whoops, I'll be able to edit in a program very similar to this. I'll get kind of a contact sheet electronically, and I'll look at the picture, I'll pull it up, I'll attach a caption to it, all the proper caption information, and then I will attach by a cord my satellite phone, which now there's a company in the UAE, the United Arab Emirates, called Thuraya, which makes a satellite phone that's about this big. And it's a little slow if I don't have a faster sat phone to use, but if I'm out in the field, I can use that. And all I need is electricity or battery power, and within 10 minutes I can have a picture in New York, which really, I don't understand how that happens. And it's just amazing. And then I can call somebody. And when it's really amazing, you know. And when I was covering the Dean campaign earlier this year, we were in some places in the Midwest, and I couldn't get a picture back to New York to save my life. It would take so long, and so it's really extraordinary what we can do these days. And it's just made things really, really easy. It's made every journalist a one-person wire service, essentially. Hi.
This is a big question, and I don't know if you're going to want to answer it. I was just wondering, because because of the nature of your work and the fact that you've seen so many things up close that so many people are following and wondering about. If you have a sense of any part of the big picture that you'd like to share with us, that's kind of why I came tonight, to just get a bigger sense of what's going on
And where we're going with all this.
Yeah.
I think we all want to know that. I mean, I want to know that too. I'd like to know if I'm going to be around for a while or if I'm going to be in some other strange place. But I think that what's happening right now with the 9/11 Commission hearings is really important. I think it's really important to pay attention to the news these days and ask tough questions and get your news from more than one source. Read different points of view, conservative and liberal. And I can't offer you any insight. You know, I'm not a fortune teller. I do know we've made a lot of people very angry around the world. And that concerns me a lot. It does concern me that we know that nuclear technology has been sold. If it gets into the hands of a non-state group, I think that could be a big problem. I do think that I don't think that we've seen the last terrorist attack on U.S. soil. But I don't think anybody would disagree with me there, you know. So I can't offer you any big picture stuff. Sorry.
That was very helpful. I appreciate it.
And that's not happy news. I'm sorry.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your perspective as a New Yorker and a witness to what happened on September 11th, and perhaps how your perspective changed going out there across the world and seeing this story unfold from a very different perspective. Perhaps how it changed as a photographer, but also just personally as a New Yorker, having again witnessed that event.
I don't think I'm a typical New Yorker in that sense, because I'd been based overseas before, and I had been based in the Middle East and had traveled around the Middle East, and I had covered terrorism and acts of terrorism before. And so when this happened and I knew it was an act of terrorism, I wasn't surprised. I was surprised it had taken this long. So it didn't really change me. It didn't really change my perspective dramatically. It deepened my understanding of things. I'd never been to Pakistan or Iraq or Afghanistan, and it helped broaden my knowledge of those parts of the world as well. But New Yorkers, I can say, they're a tough group. I mean, they really rolled with the punches as much as you could in that situation, and people really came together and helped each other. And in a city of 8 million people, I thought that was pretty extraordinary. And I thought one of the changes in New York, which was really interesting, was when we had the blackout last summer, there was virtually no looting, and there was this attitude of, this is nothing, you know, after September 11th. And I really think it changed New Yorkers. They're really resilient. So.
I have a question about U.S. forces. After being in Iraq for 3 months, do you think that they recognized or understood the tribal and ethnic conflicts that were going on in Iraq?
I think that's a really good question, and I think it really depends on the individual soldier and the amount of interaction they have on a daily basis. You have a lot of, I know there are a lot of college students here, but you have a lot of people your age who haven't traveled before, who haven't left the United States, who maybe haven't left their region of the United States, who maybe never left their state. And suddenly they're transported into this place, and they don't know where they are, or who these people are, or what's going on. And your basic infantry soldier, I think, has very little understanding in most cases, not in all cases. And I wish that they were given a little more information. When I was in Afghanistan, I went out to the air base when the first wave of soldiers came in, and there had been shooting the night before because it was celebratory gunfire because of the holiday, and that's a very typical thing in this part of the world. And people fire guns at weddings to celebrate. They fire guns at funerals. They fire, it's on holidays they fire guns, and so there was a lot of shooting that night. And the next day, I was at this air base and I was photographing the soldiers, and I said, there was a lot of noise last night, and he said to me, yeah, we didn't know what was happening. We thought we were coming under attack. So there was even that basic little bit of cultural information wasn't passed along to him. And then I asked another one, I said, well, where are you from? And his hometown was Baltimore, Maryland. And Hamid Karzai, who's in charge of Afghanistan now, the leader of Afghanistan, had spent a lot of time in Baltimore. And I said, oh, Karzai's hometown. And he said, who? And so it was surprising to me that he had such a little understanding of where he was. But the Special Forces soldiers are older, educated, very well educated. It's not, they're not your average, they're not a high school dropout who joins the Army, And they had a very good understanding. There were Arabic speakers, Colonel Waltemeyer, who was really having to get to know the tribal leaders and the customs, and having to sit at many a feast, whether he was hungry or not, and eat it. He really understood. He got it. So I think it really varies. It's a long answer to your question, but I hope it helps.
I have two questions. One concerns about the casualties to the civilians in Iraq and what sense you had of how much and what went on in order to achieve our victory or our liberation. And in the hospitals where you were, did you have a sense that there was incoming American aid to help the hospitals with the carnage, just supplies? I've really been wondering how we could help here in Missoula link up with sending medical aid. I haven't read too much about whether we've tried to patch that part of the damage to the civilian people.
Well, there are a lot of aid organizations that are working now and trying to work now. Of course, the problem now is that aid workers are unfortunately becoming targets themselves, and we'll just have to see which way that one goes. Things can change really fast there. Medical supplies, first of all, it's hard to get a big picture, I think, on the civilian casualties. I was listening to a radio program a couple days ago about this too, about the numbers, and it's very controversial, and nobody can really compile it. It's hard to know. There were definitely a lot of civilian casualties. But I saw American soldiers treating wounded Iraqis also. So, I really don't know enough about that to answer your question well. But in terms of aid organizations and what you can do, you can certainly contact aid organizations and ask them. And they're the best people to tell you what can be done and what you can do personally. So.
I was just wondering, were these pictures are taken sort of on the go, or did you take time to sort of take each picture?
It's a good question. Most of these images, I was in a position where I could actually work, and I didn't have to just get out of the car, take a quick picture, and leave. So, yeah, most of these I had time to sort of sit and work the situation.
Hi, I was wondering when you were in Pakistan and you were witnessing the anti-American protests, what the feeling was that they had towards you as an American journalist. If you felt like you were under any, like if you were susceptible to any attacks by them.
I didn't. I mean, I'm not sure that anyone would have looked at me and said, oh, that's an American journalist. Definitely looked at me and said, that's a Western journalist. No, there wasn't any hostility directed at me. Some of the more conservative demonstrations, the female photographers would be told to go in a balcony, or they couldn't be there, or they would have to leave, that sort of thing. But there was always a way of working it somehow. You just had, in those situations, you kind of did have to move quickly, because if you got yourself into a place where somebody saw you who didn't like you being there, then you just had to move on. But in some of those, I actually had a young man that I hired to sort of be my eyes and ears while I was working. And so he would go with me and listen to what was being said and what was going on while I was like focusing through the camera, and that helped as well.
What is your opinion of the American media's hesitance to show disturbing images from war making, and how do you feel that might affect the support Americans have for war making?
Okay, what's my opinion of how the media handles, say that again for me, I'm sorry.
You said earlier that the American newspapers don't like to put disturbing images on the front page, and we've all seen comparisons between, say, CNN's coverage and Al Jazeera's coverage.
Right.
And so what's your opinion of how America deals with these images, and how do you think it affects Americans?
I think that there's a portion of America that is sort of isolationist, that doesn't want to acknowledge what's going on and is just happy in their community and what's happening in their community. And, you know, it's a much happier life that way. And you know, if you look at most newspapers around the country now, foreign news is in one column, and it's paragraphs of world briefs. There's very little foreign news, and if people were really interested and wanted it, I think the newspapers would have it. You are serving a community. And I think that's detrimental. I think it's really important for us to know what's going on. We are part of the world. And, you know, so many people were caught by surprise on September 11th. Why did this happen to us? Why don't they like us? You know, I heard people saying that. And I think part of the problem is that there is this, you know, we're sort of blinding ourselves to the rest of the world.
We've got time for maybe 2 more questions, please. Thanks.
Good. I am wondering how language affected your photography, first of all. And second of all, I'd like to know when you went into the houses if you had a woman as an interpreter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is a good question. Well, you know, if I had understood the language, I probably wouldn't have had to hire that guy to stand behind me and listen as to whether or not I should be moving. I would have understood it myself to know that I wasn't welcome somewhere. So language is always an asset. When I went into the houses with the women, no, there's so much that can be said without words. It's really wonderful. And I think that photography is that kind of language. It's what it's all about. It's all about the expression of feelings, and you're responding to what you're feeling. And what you're seeing, and not necessarily what you're hearing, although of course that's a huge part of it too. And so when I would be welcomed into these women's homes, and sometimes there was a little bit of English, you know, sometimes they would speak, you know, perhaps they had a tiny bit of German, I have a tiny bit of German, or a little French, or, you know, something. But it's amazing how much you can communicate without that. They would show me their children, you know, their babies, or bring me tea, or, you know, sit me down, and just, it was actually, it's kind of neat that you can communicate without words a lot, more than you think.
In one of your first pictures, you show, I don't remember who it was some palace or something like that, and there was, towards the side, there was a long, it looked like just one pointy thing with
A
this
minaret.
ball on top?
The minaret.
What was that?
This here?
Yeah, right in the corner.
A minaret from a mosque. There are towers where you would have speakers up top, and you would have the call to prayer blasted out there. In earlier days, there would be somebody called a muezzin would sing the call to prayer up there. But now that with technology, you have loudspeakers, and that's what you're looking at there. It's really pretty, isn't it? It's kind of cool.
You had mentioned earlier about how the world is very angry at us right now, and we've seen that manifesting in the news in the last week or so. And I'm wondering, from your perspective and your experience, could you elaborate on that? And also, how is being in the middle of this and seeing and experiencing this on the level that you are affecting you personally?
Okay, let's go back to the first part. Say your first part again, I'm sorry. A lot of questions today.
You said the world is angry at us.
Yes, and
I'd like you to elaborate on that.
okay. Well, we didn't have a lot of support in going into Iraq, and there are people that are now feeling that what's happened is deserved, that if we're having trouble there now, it's our own fault. There are a lot of repairs we have to do with our allies even. I mean, people in Spain, I think, are now rethinking. They were angry. The people didn't want their government to support us, and now they're feeling even more strongly about that. I'm not sure I can elaborate more than that. If you have a more specific question about that, if that does it for you. And then the personal thing, that's a question you get a lot, like how do you do this and how do you deal with it personally? And everyone deals with it differently, and it does, it comes back to haunt you. I think about these people, I think about situations, and they come back at, strange times. When I'm in the middle of just doing some routine thing, I'll just suddenly start thinking about someone. It makes me sad, makes me angry. We're really lucky to live in this country. We have, compared to the rest of the world, a beautiful standard of living. We have a lot of freedoms. I think sometimes we take them for granted way too much. And I think I try not to take things for granted anymore. So, thank you all very, very much.
Thank you for coming, Ruth. You're a very brave, intelligent woman. I hope you keep seeing pictures and explaining the world to us through them. Thank you all very much for coming. Good night.